Жили-были старик со старухой. Вот старик и говорит старухе: «Старуха, испеки ко мне колобок, что-то есть очень хочется». «А из чего испечь? Муки-то нет». «А ты по амбару поскреби, по сусеку помети, глядишь, да наскребешь муки на колобок». Пошла старуха, по амбару поскребла, по сусеку помела и набрала немного муки. Замесила старуха тесто, испекла колобок, да на окошко студить положила. А он взял, да и убежал.
Throughout the 20th century, the Soviet powers attempted, without ever truly succeeding, to resolve one particular problem, that of feeding the people. The lands of Russia and Ukraine have always been fertile. They were known as the breadbasket of Europe. Yet the people living there have always known hunger. Following the October Revolution, the new Soviet power structure was keen to reorganize agriculture, introducing the latest scientific advances. From the scientists, they expected miracles. Among the men tasked with accomplishing these prodigies of progress, there were two in particular. One, Nikolai Vavilov, was a botanist. The other, Trofim Lyssenko, was an agronomist. The clash between these two men is the story of the most dramatic failure in the history of the USSR, the inability of the Soviet regime to feed its people. In 1917, with the country already devastated by the First World War, Russia was plunged into revolutionary chaos. Russian soldiers returned from the front not to peace, but to another conflict, a civil war. The country was in ruins, and the people were starving. Lenin's first priority was to supply the Red Army and the cities. He decreed war communism, one of the first measures of which was the requisition of agricultural produce. Army detachments scoured the countryside, violently appropriating produce from any who refused to hand over their harvests. The peasants, who had for years been suffering the disastrous consequences of wars, revolutions, and bad weather, were now left in even greater penury than ever. In 1921, famine gripped the country. 40 million people did not have enough to eat. It was the first great famine to affect the territory of Soviet Russia, and 5 million died as a result. This tragedy forced the country's new leaders to look for solutions. They needed to get agriculture back on its feet, the peasants working the fields again, and production to increase rapidly. Lenin ordered the Soviet deputies to act without delay. At their Congress in December 1922, they decided to create a state institute in Petrograd, which would focus on scientific research aimed at improving agricultural practices. At the time, the one scientist capable of making a success of this gigantic project was the botanist and geneticist Nikolai Vavilov. The son of a rich Moscow entrepreneur, Nikolai Vavilov had had a dazzling academic career, graduating from the Agronomic Institute of Moscow. Before the outset of the First World War, at the age of 26, he spent 2 years traveling around Western Europe. He met the greatest names in biology and botany, did intern work in the most renowned laboratories, and learnt English, German, and French. Vavilov had a prodigious memory and a huge capacity for hard work. He slept little and devoted all his time to his research. His dream was to travel the whole world and study its plants. It was at this time that he developed his all-consuming interest in selecting and improving seed strains. The young researcher's stubborn determination produced results. In 1916, Vavilov managed to secure a grant to undertake his first scientific expedition to Iran and the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia. It was an expedition full of dangers, from menacing glaciers to narrow mountain footpaths, but nothing stopped Vavilov. At an altitude of 2,000 meters, he discovered a valley abundant in grain.
This grain exceeds even our wildest hopes. There's a gigantic rye plant over 1 meter high, with thick stems and fat ears and grains. This extraordinary rye is a plant endemic to the region.
This expedition was the start of the great project which would keep Vavilov busy his whole life, the creation of a world seed bank. Vavilov traveled the 5 continents, from the Caribbean to Abyssinia, from China to North Africa by way of Arabia and Afghanistan. Everywhere, his interest was in understanding the history of the plants grown there and discovering their ancestral forms. Vavilov was a visionary, one of the first people to realize the importance of biological and botanical diversity in ensuring the future food security of humanity. From all around the world, he sent dozens of parcels back to Russia, parcels containing seeds and plants from wild, uncultivated zones, as well as farmland. Vavilov's collection, his world collection as he called it, consisted of tens of thousands of specimens stored in his institute in Petrograd, as well as in his experimental stations scattered throughout the country. With this multitude of seed varieties at their disposal, Soviet scientists had the means to experiment with the creation of new plant species. But such research needs a lot of time, and time was something those in power didn't have. Farming in the country was in a disastrous state. Real measures were needed without delay to put the country back on its feet. In 1921, Lenin was forced to accept the failure of his war communism. He launched his new economic policy, or NEP. There was to be no more requisitioning. Land was privatized, and peasants were once more allowed to sell their produce at market. The result was an immediate increase in agricultural production. But Russia still had an urgent need of seed for sowing. The government sent Nikolai Vavilov to the United States to buy several tons of seed from American companies, paying in gold taken from the reserves of the young Soviet state. On this trip, Vavilov visited the laboratory of the famous American geneticist Thomas Hunt Morgan. Morgan's work on chromosomes and the transmission of genetic inheritance had been exciting Vavilov for several years. As for Morgan, he considered Vavilov a brilliant young scientist. At this time, The worldwide scientific community was undergoing a veritable revolution with the emergence of genetics. Vavilov was enthusiastic about this new branch of science, convinced that it would lead to advances in agriculture. His plan was to import the geneticist's latest discoveries into Russia and apply them in the Research Institute of Plant Industry, which he ran in Petrograd. In 1925, the new regime celebrated with great pomp the Russian Academy of Sciences' 200th anniversary. Contact with foreign scientists, which had broken down during the revolution, was now re-established. Once again, Russian science was in evidence at international conferences. Nikolai Vavilov, the leading light of Soviet biology, was over the moon. He firmly believed in one unique international science. He saw the scientific revolution as part of the communist revolution, with which it went hand in hand.
Without science, we cannot construct socialism. The work of the large-scale selection of plants begins with revolution.
Vavilov was now the emblematic figure of Soviet science, a figure of international renown in the domain of genetic and botanical research, his work recognized by his peers throughout the world. On the 7th of August 1927, the newspaper Pravda published an article about a certain Trofim Lyssenko. This young agricultural researcher, aged just 29, was working in one of the experimental stations of the huge institute run by Vavilov. The interesting results of his experiments were getting him noticed. Pravda's journalist described an eccentric character who liked to walk around his plantations barefoot. Lyssenko gives one the feeling of a toothache. God give him health. He has a dejected mien. Stingy of words and insignificant of face is he. All one remembers is his sullen look creeping along the earth, as if he were ready to do someone in. Pravda's journalist was intrigued, and despite his less than flattering description, he praised this son of a peasant, whom he nicknamed the Barefoot Professor. In the Soviet Union, just the mention of someone's name in Pravda could change their destiny, for better or worse. Trofim Lyssenko's star was on the rise. Trofim Lyssenko was born in Ukraine to a family of poor peasants. He was the eldest son, and as tradition demanded, he spent his childhood helping his father in the fields. At the age of 13, he went to the village school where he learnt to read and write. While still young, Lyssenko's dream was to become an agronomist. He pursued his studies by studying horticulture and then attending the Kiev Agricultural Institute. The article in Pravda strengthened Lyssenko's confidence in his own abilities as an agricultural researcher. That same year, Lyssenko announced his first discovery, vernalization. This was a method which consisted of planting winter crops in spring. To spur the seeds to germinate, they were wettened and submitted to a cooling treatment. Lyssenko claimed that vernalization would bring about a threefold increase in harvests. Just as Lyssenko was starting to be talked about, Soviet agricultural policy was undergoing a major change. In 1929, Stalin called an end to Lenin's new economic policy and proclaimed the Great Turn. In fact, the new economic policy launched by Lenin was severely frowned on by the left-wingers in the Communist Party. It was said that Stalin's sleep was disturbed by thinking about peasants getting rich from their privatized land. He therefore launched a total forced collectivization of agriculture with the creation of kolkhoz and sovkhoz, enormous state farms intended to replace individual exploitations. Nikolai Vavilov, from his position in his institute, was enthusiastic about this development. He thought this new way of organizing agriculture would give the Russian peasants access to scientific advances. He wrote,
Science, that's the driving force. Sovkhozes, kolkhozes, or whatever, our new peasants have to work the land with science.
The politicians were putting more and more pressure on the agricultural selectors and researchers, demanding rapid results to increase yields. In this context, Trofim Lyssenko was just the right sort of character to win over the party leaders. A real prodigy who promised to multiply the harvest by means of his famous discovery, vernalization. The implementation of this discovery will play a crucial role in our development, announced a communiqué from the Department of Agriculture. Nikolai Vavilov was interested in Lyssenko, as he was interested in any kind of experiment that could further scientific research. The young researcher impressed the academic with his energy and daring. Vavilov invited Lyssenko to give a presentation at the Pan-Soviet Congress of Geneticists and Selectors in Leningrad, attended by several foreign scientists. Lyssenko's talk was not very enthusiastically received. The geneticists present pointed out that there was nothing particularly new about vernalization. They even considered it a bit of a folk remedy, unlikely to produce results in the long term. The peasant's son felt henceforth that he wasn't welcome in the world of scientists. In the countryside, the first effects of forced collectivization were starting to be felt, and they were catastrophic. The kulaks, the peasants who had grown rich as a result of the new economic policy, disagreed with this new drive and refused to join the kolkhoz. Stalin ordered their elimination. Thus began the dekulakization of the countryside. With the help of the Red Army and the political police, the land of any who grumbled about collectivization was confiscated. Their property was seized, and they were either executed on the spot or deported to forced labor camps. In 1932, the dreaded famine made another appearance. Ukraine, Byelorussia, and North Caucasus, Kazakhstan, the Urals, and West Siberia, every part of the USSR was affected. This time, over 60 million people didn't have enough to eat, and the famine killed from 6 to 8 million. A direct consequence of forced collectivization, this disaster was completely covered up by the regime. Stalin needed culprits to blame. Who failed to create seed strains resistant to bad weather? Who was unable to increase yields? As far as he was concerned, it was the fault of the scientists. A wave of arrests of biologists and agronomists followed. Vavilov was spared. For the moment, he was untouchable. As president of the Academy of Agricultural Science, he enjoyed great international prestige and was considered a top-class researcher. This was guaranteed to incite Stalin's ire. Vavilov embodied everything that Stalin hated. He was an independent scientist from a bourgeois background, with friends all over the world. Lyssenko had none of these failings. He represented everything that Stalin appreciated. He was a peasant, a true member of the proletariat, a man of simple words and accessible ideas, who, unlike the scientists, promised immediate results. Throughout the country, they were starting to implement Lyssenko's venalization methods, which he showed a certain genius in promoting. He sent regular reports to the newspapers and the political authorities to keep them updated about the results of his work. But what no one knew was that the method used for evaluating the results was worthless. This took the form of a simple questionnaire to be filled in by the kolkhoz workers themselves. And they, fearing punishment, gave incorrect figures which no one checked. As for Lyssenko, he kept upping the ante. Each overblown promise he made merely served to reinforce his position. He was, in fact, quite an expert at bluffing, an inherent part of the Stalinist system. The bigger the lie, the better it was received. All economic figures and statistics were fiddled to meet Stalin's expectations. Forecasts for the 5-year plans were overestimated and totally unrealistic. This was the same era which created such heroic mythologies as the famous Stakhanovite movement, named after the miner Stakhanov, who, legend had it, increased the quantity of coal mined in a day by a factor of 14.
Чем объяснить, что стахановское движение оказалось таким назревшим? Таковы причины того, что оно так объяло все отрасли нашего хозяйства, все районы и области нашей великой страны. Какие причины? Их много, этих самых причин. Можно было бы указать несколько. Во-первых, жить стало лучше, товарищи. Жить стало веселее.
Звонки, как птицы, одна за другой, песни летят над советской страной. Здесь темноте городов и полей, жить стало лучше, жить стало веселей. Здесь темноте городов и полей, жить стало лучше, жить стало веселей.
In August 1932, Nikolai Vavilov was getting ready for a trip to the United States. He was going to Ithaca, New York, for the 6th International Congress of Genetics and Selection, of which he was the vice president. Vavilov thought it would provide an excellent opportunity to promote Lyssenko's work abroad. With the approval of the Department of Agriculture, he therefore invited the agronomist to be part of the Soviet delegation. But Lyssenko refused. He didn't speak any foreign languages and didn't feel at ease in an academic environment. At the Congress, in his speech about the successes of Soviet biology, Vavilov declared that
Trofim Lyssenko's extraordinary discovery opens up huge and unexpected possibilities for farmers and geneticists around the world.
Why, despite the reticence and incredulity of foreign scientists, did Vavilov go on supporting Lyssenko? Why did he continue to admire his work and encourage his experiments? The treatments promoted by Lyssenko changed the characteristics of seeds, making them more resistant to frost. But the grain varieties in the Institute's collection, which Vavilov had brought back from warmer countries, were very sensitive to low temperatures. They didn't grow in Russia's cold regions. Still, Vavilov thought that by applying Lyssenko's methods to them, they might create new varieties which were resistant to sub-zero temperatures, thereby obtaining abundant harvests. And so Vavilov mobilized his teams, making his world collection of seeds available for Lyssenko's experiments. One man would propel Lyssenko's career towards new heights. His name was Isaac Present. Having originally studied law, Present now chose biology as the field in which to exercise his skills. When he met Lyssenko, he realized how beneficial this man could be to his own career. and he became both his mentor and spokesperson. Isaac Prezent knew that Lyssenko wouldn't go far without a solid ideological base, so he set himself the task of providing this. For Lyssenko's career to stay on course, his theories had to conform strictly to Marxist-Leninist ideology. At the same time, Stalin received a report from the secret services about several Soviet biologists and agronomists. The political stance of Nikolai Vavilov is hostile to the Communist Party and the Supreme Soviet, the report said. Within a small group, Vavilov criticizes the methods of the Soviet government, blaming it for the famines. This was one of the first reports in the Secret Services dossier on Nikolai Vavilov, a dossier which was to grow bigger over time. The Second Congress of Outstanding Kolkhozniks took place in Moscow on the 15th of February 1935. Lyssenko had been invited to speak. He stepped up to the tribune and looked at the audience. Behind him sat all the bigwigs of the Soviet regime, with Stalin in pride of place. His speech was supposed to be about vernalization, but directly inspired by Isaac Prezent, it went off on an entirely different tangent.
There are parasitic kulaks in the kolkhozes, but not only there. You kolkhozniks know how to recognize them. But in the scientific community there are also parasite kulaks, and they are just as dangerous. In order to defend vernalization from these pseudo-scientists, we mustn't be afraid to shed blood and come to blows. A class enemy is always an enemy, whether he's a scientist or not.
Недаром, товарищи, я пожалел, и довольно искренне пожалел, своих кровных врагов, которые находятся в СНГУ и теперь боятся противостоять. Это буржуазных ученых.
At this point, his speech was interrupted. Someone shouted, "Bravo, Comrade Lyssenko, bravo!" It was Stalin, who had stood up and started applauding. A moment later, the palace of the Kremlin erupted in thundering applause. Lyssenko's speech conformed to party lines. At that time in the USSR, every single human activity, of whatever kind, had to be undertaken according to the communist ideal. Sculpting, playing chess, drawing, everything. And biology was no exception. The scientific debate had become a political debate. And at the heart of this debate was the theory of heredity. How do living organisms, human beings, animals, plants, transmit their characteristics to their descendants? Is it possible to transform an individual during its lifetime, making it better, more attractive, more resistant, more obedient? And if so, how? The scholastic geneticists, the adversaries of Trofim Lyssenko and Isaac Prezent, were categorical that organisms' characteristics are transmitted through their genes and that it is chromosomes which provide the physical support for heredity. The genes of living organisms are stable and do not change because of a modification in their environment. Lyssenko and his followers, however, rejected the existence of chromosomes. They claimed that the characteristics of living organisms change according to their environmental context, and that they transmit these changes to their descendants. This theory had no scientific basis. It was nothing more than a forced transposition of a political ideology. The advancement of a species is driven by the effort of individuals. Using this as his basis, Lyssenko dismissed genetics as a bourgeois science incompatible with Marxism-Leninism. He was defending the only true science, proletarian science. This vision of science suited Stalin perfectly. It suited his contention that the favorable environment developed in a communist society could modify the characteristics of individuals and give rise to a new man. But the theories of the scholastic geneticists stood in the way of this grandiose project, and genetics was thus deemed a reactionary discipline. From that moment on, Lyssenko and his friends would do all they could to crush it. Vavilov tried to resist, yet he refused to enter into an ideological debate, which held no interest for him. As far as he was concerned, all that mattered was the science, and it would eventually triumph over all this nonsense. But the gulf between Vavilov and Lyssenko had now grown too wide. Collaboration of any kind was henceforth out of the question. Vavilov's friends were arrested or relieved of their positions. Vavilov knew he was under threat, yet still he made a public announcement.
I believe the edifice of genetics is immovable because it stands on a foundation of a huge amount of precise experimentation. The only way to refute the edifice of genetics would be to oppose it with the same number of experiments of equal precision. In their absence, genetics remains. We shall go to the pyre, we shall burn, but we shall not retreat from our convictions.
Оглашается приговор. Именем Союза Советских Социалистических Республик, военной коллегии Верховного Суда Союза в составе председателя...
It was now, in the years just before the Second World War, that Stalin's Great Terror began. Huge show trials against the enemies of the people were held in Moscow. Throughout the USSR, massive demonstrations were organized to convince the people of a vast anti-Soviet conspiracy.
Бухаринской враги хотели нашу молодую Советскую Республику, ее разделить на куски. Но у нас есть НКВД, который руководит верный сталинист Николай Иванович Ежов.
Between 1936 and 1938, there were some 700,000 executions, while 2 million were deported to gulags. All of society was affected by these purges, and the scientific community was by no means safe. Among the hundreds of biologists, botanists, and agronomists who were persecuted were those who had taken a stance against the theory of proletarian science. While Vavilov was now increasingly isolated, Lyssenko's star continued to rise. He was made president of the Academy of Agricultural Science and enjoyed privileged access to the Kremlin. He convinced Stalin that Vavilov was a hindrance to socialist agriculture. On the 20th of November 1939, Stalin summoned Nikolai Vavilov to the Kremlin at 10 o'clock in the evening. He finally received him in his office at midnight. He did not offer Vavilov a seat. Comrade Vavilov, how much longer will you go on fiddling with your little flowers and such nonsense? Who is going to increase our agricultural output? Stalin asked. Vavilov tried to justify himself by explaining the huge work his institute was undertaking. Stalin paced up and down, his pipe in his hand. He interrupted Vavilov. Is that all you have to say? You can go. It was the last time the two men met. 1939 was the year of the German-Soviet Pact. Ribbentrop, the Reich's Minister of Foreign Affairs, traveled to Moscow to sign this non-aggression pact between the two powers. The treaty effectively divided up a sizable part of Western Europe between the USSR and Nazi Germany, allowing the Soviet Union to annex several territories, including that of West Ukraine. The region was renowned for its fertility, and in 1940, the Department of Agriculture started sending scientists there to assess the new land and plan how best to exploit it. Nikolai Vavilov was appointed expedition leader for West Ukraine. He was happy to be back out again, doing what he liked best. On his arrival, he admired the fields of wheat stretching as far as the eye could see. He was totally captivated. Every 5 kilometers, he'd tell his driver to stop, and before the car had even come to a halt, he'd be out running through the fields, filling little cloth bags with samples of wheat, barley and oats. On the 6th of August 1940, late in the evening, a black car pulled up at the hostel where the members of the expedition were staying. 2 men got out, went up to Vavilov, and informed him that he was wanted on an urgent matter back in Moscow. Vavilov got into the car, and it drove off. He was never to be free again. You have been arrested as an active member of an organization committed to sabotaging Soviet agriculture and as a spy in the service of foreign intelligence services. Do you admit your guilt? Such were the words of Lieutenant Alexander Kvat, a man whose efficacy was particularly appreciated by Beria, head of the secret police. Kvat was entrusted with the Vavilov case and questioned him for almost a year. Every interrogation began with the same question. Who are you? I am the academic Vavilov. You're not an academic. You're a piece of shit, the lieutenant would reply. After 11 months, Vavilov finally cracked and confessed. The confession was, of course, total make-believe. I admit that since 1930, I have been a member of an anti-Soviet organization at the heart of the USSR's Department of Agriculture. On the 9th of July 1941, 17 days after Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union, the military college of the Supreme Court sentenced Nikolai Vavilov to death by firing squad. On the 14th of October, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. The government decided on an emergency evacuation of all important prisoners. Among them was Nikolai Vavilov. He was moved 700 kilometers from Moscow to the town of Saratov. Vavilov spent the next 2 years in a cell on death row. On the 23rd of January 1943, aged 56, Nikolai Vavilov, the man who wanted to feed all of humankind, died of hunger and exhaustion in Saratov prison. The war had pushed scientific debate to the background. All energy was concentrated on defending the country. The German occupation of a vast expanse of fertile farmland made the already disastrous state of Soviet agriculture even worse. While the men were fighting at the front, women, children, and old people tried to survive on the blighted land. Resources were lacking everywhere, and famine made its reappearance, especially in the countryside. In the towns, they decided to create small private vegetable gardens, workers' allotments, to compensate for the shortages. They mainly grew potatoes. It was in such a situation that Lyssenko's talents came into their own. The agronomist revived an age-old method for growing potatoes, which consisted of replanting only the part that had chitted. In other words, the people could plant the sprout while still eating most of the potato. The method was well adapted to working small private plots of land. Lyssenko had his farming advice published in the newspapers. It was a positive measure for fighting famine, and Lyssenko's popularity grew once again. he was awarded a Hero of the Soviet Union medal, one more decoration for his chest. The victory in 1945, bringing the end of the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in the USSR, was but a brief pause in the long, dark night of Stalinism. The Allies were talking to each other, and from both sides of the Iron Curtain, scientists were communicating and exchanging once again. But the foreign scientists visiting the Soviet Union started asking questions. What had happened to the great Nikolai Vavilov? No one was able to answer them. But Stalin had an idea about how to stop the Western scientists being too insistent with their inquiries. At the time, he was looking for a personality on whom he could confer the presidency of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He decided to offer this very prestigious post to a scientist of the highest caliber, the physicist Sergei Vavilov, who was none other than the younger brother of Nikolai Vavilov. Stalin summoned him to the Kremlin. After a short preamble about his merits, he made the announcement. Comrade Vavilov, for political reasons, the Politburo has decided to offer you the post of President of the Academy of Sciences. Sergei Vavilov was caught unawares. Stalin didn't wait for an answer before going on. Do you have any request to make to the Soviet government? Sergei Vavilov hesitated, but then took the plunge. Comrade Stalin, I would like some news of my brother, Nikolai. Stalin picked up his telephone, and after a short conversation, spoke the following few words as he looked Sergei Vavilov directly in the eye. To think they did away with such a man. In one short phrase, Stalin unburdened himself of any responsibility for the tragic fate of the greatest man of Soviet science. Between 1946 and 1948, famine returned, claiming over 1 million victims. Once again, the Kremlin's policies were largely to blame. Rather than distributing its harvests to the people, the USSR exported millions of tons of wheat in exchange for the industrial material needed to reconstruct the country. To bolster the Soviet Union's image in France, at a time when the communists were in government there, the USSR supplied the country with 500,000 tons of wheat. Also, as the Soviet Union settled into the Cold War, with the constant fear of another armed conflict, it stockpiled millions of tons of wheat for that eventuality. A major part of these strategic reserves rotted in warehouses and was never consumed by the people, who were dying of hunger, a fact completely covered up by the regime. Stalin summoned Lyssenko to the Kremlin to talk about the agricultural situation. Comrade Lyssenko, I defeated fascism. It's up to you to defeat nature and feed our people. Lyssenko replied that he could solve all the problems in record time. As long as he were rid, he added, of these geneticists who were constantly groveling to the West.
Comrade Stalin, genes don't exist. They're a myth invented by idealists. What exactly is a gene? Who's ever seen one, or touched one, or tasted one?
Stalin knew that Lyssenko was being challenged by the defenders of genetics. He gave him the opportunity to reaffirm his authority at an extraordinary session of the Academy of Agricultural Science. On the eve of his appearance, Stalin requested to see the text of Lyssenko's speech. He reread and corrected it, adding a few wordings of his own. Where Lyssenko, for example, had written bourgeois genetics, Stalin crossed out bourgeois and replaced it with reactionary. On the 31st of July 1948, Lyssenko, like the good and zealous servant of the party that he was, presented his speech, complete with Stalin's amendments, to the Academy. On that day, the science of genetics ceased to exist in the USSR. and Trofim Lyssenko was confirmed the uncontested master of Soviet agronomy. 1 month later, he was awarded the Order of Lenin, and his 50th birthday was celebrated with great pomp. Ironically, it was Sergei Vavilov, Nikolai's brother, who gave the speech honoring Lyssenko as a scientist without equal. But flattering speeches were not going to solve the problem which remained as crucial as ever. How do we feed the people? Drought was a major problem for farming in the Soviet Union. Stalin, who considered himself quite the scientist, was convinced that if they could just solve this problem, they could finally fill all the country's grain stores. He dreamt up a project which he named the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature. The idea was to create huge tracts of woodland to shield the steppes from the winds which dried them out. It was an immense project. 120 million hectares of land were planted with trees, and tens of millions of people were mobilized to carry out Stalin's plan. And in this, Stalin of course had an ally, Lyssenko. The agronomist plucked a method of his own devising out of the hat, a method which consisted of planting the trees very close together in tight groupings as a way of accelerating growth. This went completely against the kolkhozniks' ancestral ways of doing things. And it led to a total catastrophe. Hundreds of millions of trees simply died. Between 1948 and 1953, 2.5 times more trees were planted than during the 250 years that went before. But only 4% reached maturity, these being the ones which the kolkhozniks, ignoring Lyssenko's orders, planted and tended the old way.
Говорит Москва. Дорогие товарищи и друзья.
On the 5th of March 1953, Stalin died. Barely had he been placed in the mausoleum next to Lenin, than the new masters in the Kremlin started questioning his agricultural policies. Less than 2 years later, when Nikita Khrushchev took sole leadership of the party and the country, there was for the first time public acknowledgement of famine in the post-war years, of the cases of cannibalism, of the shortage of cereal and the inadequate harvests. So Khrushchev, just as Stalin had done before him, dreamt up his own massive programs, attacking the vast stretches of virgin land in Kazakhstan and Siberia, and announcing that the country would now be putting all its effort into corn. "I am Mr. Corn," he was fond of telling anyone willing to listen. But this was easier said than done, for there was a cruel lack of hybrid seeds, and now that the science of genetics had been crushed, there was no one left with the necessary expertise. Nikita Khrushchev accused the heads of the Academy of Agricultural Science. Trofim Lyssenko was starting to look a little unsteady on his pedestal. In April 1956, he was officially relieved of his functions as president of the Academy. As for Khrushchev, he sought salvation for Soviet agriculture from the enemy, America. In fact, Khrushchev was fascinated by the results obtained by a certain American farmer named Roswell Gast. On Khrushchev's famous 1959 trip across America, he stopped off at Gast's farm. Watched by cameras from all over the world, he went into raptures about the impressive crops of the Iowan farmer, exclaiming, "Why shouldn't we be able to do the same back home?" Yet Khrushchev's ambitious programs for intensive farming came to nothing. In the years that followed, the USSR had to buy huge quantities of wheat and corn from the Americans and Canadians. It was then that the hard-headed Trofim Lyssenko, striving by any means to get back into the new regime's good books, resurfaced. He invited Khrushchev to his experimental station to show him the results of his latest discovery, a miraculous fertilizer of a totally new kind, which vastly increased cereal yield. The head of the Kremlin was impressed. Lyssenko was once again in favor in the eyes of the party. But Soviet agriculture would never get back on the road to success. Having been held back by Lyssenko's stranglehold for so many years, it could not now catch up. In October 1964, the Central Committee of the Communist Party ousted Nikita Khrushchev from power. In his fall, Khrushchev dragged his allies with him, one of them being Trofim Lyssenko. Right up until 1976, the year of his death, the barefoot professor, secluded in his experimental farm on the outskirts of Moscow, continued his experiments amidst general indifference. During the Second World War, as Nikolai Vavilov was dying of hunger in Saratov prison, the city of Leningrad underwent a terrible siege. This siege lasted 872 days and killed around 1 million people. In St. Isaac's Square, the Institute of Plant Industry, created by Vavilov, stored several tons of seeds, nuts and tubers, which the botanist had gathered on his expeditions around the world. "13 scientists at the Institute preferred to starve to death rather than touch Vavilov's world collection. Today, this magnificent seed bank numbers more than 325,000 plant specimens. It's a treasure trove of biodiversity, with which Nikolai Vavilov dreamt of one day feeding humankind.